Silvercrow.
Welcome to the Urban Witch Podcast, where modern magic meets ancient wisdom. Join us as we unveil the truth around witchcraft and help you embrace your inner witch. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the word witch, what it means, the connotations, and the associations of that word throughout history. Stay tuned as we take apart the word and we dig into what it really means to be a witch today. So what is a witch? The word witch over the centuries has been, it's changed, it's evolved and differentiated sort of wildly over the years. Online now, if you do a search for what is a witch, you'll be met with a load of different types of explanations and definitions of what actually is a witch. And some are correct, some are incorrect. There's a lot of facts. There are a lot of fiction among the facts online, and so it's kind of difficult to be discerning about what it is that a witch actually is. And if we take some of those definitions, we can kind of dig into it a bit more, and we'll unpick them and figure out what the root of the word is and what a witch actually is. So if we look at the definitions given by Wikipedia, so Wikipedia it describes a witch as a practitioner of witchcraft, which is, it's not false, but it doesn't really give us a great deal to go on. And then if we look into the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is another sort of real major source of information online and offline, it describes witchcraft as a term usually applied to harm brought about by others through the use of natural or occult powers. So the person engaging in witchcraft is called a witch, while the act of causing harm may be termed cursing, hexing, bewitchment, or maleficum, which is an old English term essentially meaning like harmful magic. In the Cambridge Dictionary, it's described as a woman who is believed to have magical powers and who uses them to harm or help other people. And oddly, the American version sort of adds the extra caveat on the end, especially in stories. So it gives this connotation that witchcraft is somehow this fictional thing, this fictional entity that lives in the realms of storybook, and that it's a predominantly a woman. And as we'll kind of unpick as we go along, you'll see that that's not necessarily the case. So in Old English, if we kind of dig into the term of witch, if we dig into the word witch, there's lots of connotations. And the Old English version of witch, the original sort of term of witch before it became witch, is wiccae. So that's the feminine, that's the female. It's described as a female magician, sorceress, enchantress. And later on, it kind of shifted to being. It never really had connotations of the devil and all of that stuff before, but later on it kind of shifted to encompass people, or predominantly women, who worship the devil or who practice magic according to the will of the devil, essentially. And so really it was all connected to sort of evil spirits and all of that, and demons and the devil. But that only came quite a bit later. So the Old English was wiccae, which is spelled W-I-C-C-E. And then the Old English masculine version of that is wicca, which is W-I-C-C-A. And that essentially just meant sorcerer or wizard, or a man who practices witchcraft or magic in that sense. So both of those terms, both of those masculine and feminine terms, come from the verb wiccian, which is meaning essentially to practice witchcraft, to practice magic, and it shifts and evolves from the German word wicken and wiccan, which is to use witchcraft or magic, and it comes from Wicca, which is soothsayer. So you can see kind of how the words have shifted and changed. But what is also noticeable in all of that is the fact that there is no gender attached to it. There's no masculine or feminine particularly exclusive for the word witch. The word witch isn't attached it was attached to women far later on than that, but originally it wasn't ever attached to just one gender. It was attached to anybody who was a magical user in that sense, or who used magic in any sort of form, in any shape or form. And back in sort of medieval times, then the predominant sort of medicinal practice was of what we would class as witches today. You know, the cunning folk and cunning people back then were the wise people in the village. They were the people who made herbal remedies and treated illness and ailments. They were the people who understood about religious ritual and rites, and that kept traditions alive and things like that. So that they were who we would describe as a witch now, but none of it had anything to do with demons, the devil, or any of that stuff until far later on. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail in another episode, but you can see how things have shifted and changed over time. And what's important to say, really, I guess, the whole thing with the gender and the whole thing with being, you know, that women are witches. And yes, there are, you know, predominantly women are witches in our Western sort of modern day practice, but also there are a lot of male witches too, as you know, I'm one of them essentially. And that's only really in our sort of English speaking world, I guess, in that sense. When you go further afield, if you go to sort of Eastern Europe, places like Russia, you know, 3 in 4 magical practitioners, 3 in 4 witches essentially were men, you know. And other Scandinavian countries, Scandinavian countries, places like Iceland and Finland, there was a lot of male witches, and that they were the sort of dominant gender, I guess, in that sense, who practiced magic. So it only shifted towards being directed towards women a lot later in history. Prior to that, there was no distinction between male or female, particularly, you know, only sort of changing the slight language that's used. Wicca and Wicca were just the masculine and feminine verbs of that in that sense. So you can kind of see how it shifts and how it's all changed over time. And really, that's essentially what it was. You know, that is essentially how things transpired over the centuries. And so when we kind of look into going further afield, you know, we get all of this connotation about the devil and Satan and magic being used as a kind of in an insidious type way. And that again is a more modern sort of way of looking at things. That only came into sort of like the medieval modern period kind of thing. You know, that was sort of in the 1400s onwards from there. So before that, it was not seen that way. You know, most people, it was accepted that most people practice magic, you know, in some shape or form. And even in sort of early Christian times, when Christianity was coming into the British Isles and when Christianity was coming into, you know, the Western world, it was still just accepted that this is the traditions that these pagan people have always practiced. You know, let them have their traditions. Essentially, there was no sort of real issue with it, particularly early on. The issues only came about much later when Satan and the idea of the devil being in league with witches was kind of became the dominant belief in that sense. So it didn't really happen for quite a while. There's a good few hundred years where they were just letting everyone get on with their sort of ancient practices, with their folk practices and folk traditions and rituals and so on. And as far as all of that goes, you know, even today there are some kind of fear-filled connotations about witches being connected to the devil and witches being connected to Satan. And it's just not true. The devil and Satan aren't figures who feature in pagan belief systems predominantly. And even in terms of witchcraft practice itself, you know, the devil isn't something that any witches I know, particularly, that any of them worship or any of them pray to or any of them hold any kind of ceremony to, because he's not a figure that features in witchcraft. That was purely this sort of, I guess it was a form of propaganda. It was a form of early propaganda to turn people away from their ancient practices and to embrace sort of the new religion of Christianity in that sense. And so it shifted over the centuries like that. And really, if we think about what is regarded as witchcraft now, as magic and witchcraft nowadays, what we have now, the practice of witches now looks very different to the practice of witches in early history. The types of people who we would have regarded as witches back in medieval times, the practices of those people would have been very different to what we have now. There may have been some sort of similarities, but the vast majority of the practice would be very, very different. And so what we're practicing now is essentially modern witchcraft, and modern in the terms of it's a bit of an amalgamation between ancient sort of practices of kind of herb lore and herb craft, herbalism, sort of ancient rituals and rites and traditions, but that's also been mashed together with far more recent practices such as Wicca. The introduction of Wicca was only in the 1930s by Joe Gardner, and then from the 1930s there was a bit of a kind of a while for it to sort of take hold a little bit, and then there was a bit of a resurgence in the 60s and 70s, and then now much of the stuff that we see online around witchcraft is actually Wicca. It's Wicca based practice in that sense. So we do kind of have to be careful with lumbering it all in together, because the practices of witches, people who we would regard as witches back in medieval times are not the same as witches that we would regard now. The two are very, very different. So it's important to make that distinction, I guess. So yeah, so I guess that's a good way of separating the types of witches that we're talking about here. The modern witch, which is what we see today, what I am and what most other witches who are around today are, and then the witches who were deemed as witches back in those days. It's important to say they probably wouldn't have claimed themselves as witches. They wouldn't have called themselves a witch, because that was a different term. It had a different meaning at that point. So it's an important distinction to make. So witchcraft practice is often regarded as it's always seen, and it's kind of thrown in with the occult arts. And the word occult essentially means that which is hidden. So you could describe witchcraft as a practice which is aimed at the seeking of that which is hidden, or the awareness and understanding of that which is hidden. And that could cover a huge area of possibilities, really. That which is hidden is often about energy, energy, that's the natural energies that are all around us all the time. It could be about spirit, the realm of the living, the realm of the dead. It could be about sort of the clear audiences, the clairvoyancy, the clear senses, I guess. So clairaudiency, clairvoyancy, clairalience, clairsentience, and so on. So there's a connection with all of those things there. So all of those would be classed as kind of occult knowledge, I guess. And so occult knowledge, in that sense, looking back into history, it's aimed at gauging and becoming aware, bringing our awareness to, but also understanding and studying and really digging into knowledge of things that are perhaps hidden from us, or perhaps even that have been lost to time. We've, as a species now, we've probably forgotten far more than we actually know now. We see ourselves as this kind of advanced species, but we've probably forgotten more of our history than we actually know. And so a lot of knowledge has been lost. And part of witchcraft practice for a lot of people is also about digging into our ancestors, looking at ancestral history, looking at practices and ways of life and ways of being of our ancestors. And as a result of that, a lot of knowledge comes up that is very that is relatively unknown in modern times. So it is a sense of digging into that which is hidden, digging into hidden knowledge, hidden practices, hidden ways of being, things that are kind of not really spoken about. And encompassing some of that is things like taboos as well. There are certain taboos that surround any kind of occult practice, but particularly witchcraft in general, which are deemed to be difficult to speak about. And so part of that nature, that hidden nature, that sort of secretive nature and secretive knowledge, and this connection with the darkness and connection with demons and all of that stuff, and the devil and Satan, that all came from way before, all of that now has started to sort of seep in. And what we get, where we find ourselves now with people's understanding of what a witch is we're finding that we are starting to see that there's a lot of misinformation out there online, a lot of misdirection, a lot of just blatant fiction, really. And so this is where we find ourselves with sort of trying to drill down what the word witch actually means. There is a real shift. There is a real change. And really over the centuries, there's been sort of there's probably about 4 different meanings for the word witch. We have the satanic type witch of the medieval period that was all connected with doing the work of the devil and maleficium that I spoke about earlier, this malignant type of magic. And we have like the modern definition of a witch that would be given by modern witches, I guess, which is essentially someone who, as well as seeking the sort of hidden practices and occult knowledge in that sense, it's also people who are connected deeply to nature. Most witches are very deep. They have a very deep connection with the natural world, and we appreciate the natural world. We have awareness of things, even things in the natural world that are relatively hidden. It could be something as simple as like an understanding of how plants and trees work. And particularly as a green urban witch, myself, that's exactly part of my practice, and that's something, again, that we'll speak of in a bit more detail in another episode. But you can kind of see where there's a lot of this hidden practice, and so we have a deep connection to nature. We tend to operate on natural cycles. Natural cycles of nature tend to be quite important to us, whether that's the seasons or the lunar cycles, the solar cycles, certain times of year, and so on. So there's lots of I guess the modern witch is kind of connected to those things, and our practices evolve around that type of those important parts of nature, I guess, in that sense. But also in terms of the disciplines of a modern witch, modern witchcraft is kind of a multidisciplinary act. It's a multidisciplinary education or knowledge, I guess, and it's never formal, and each witch's practice is completely different. My practice would be very different to the practice of another witch, and so there's no real solidified form. Everything is quite fluid and evolving, and so you start to feel this sense of fluidity, this sense of there is no right or wrong. There's this connotation of that everything has to be linear in our world, and it's not that way. Our world isn't a linear place. Humans aren't linear. Our lives aren't linear lives. Each of our lives are completely unique to ourselves, and we change and evolve over time. And what we are today may be something completely different to what we are tomorrow. And so things change over the time. And really, the disciplines of witchcraft, particularly of modern witchcraft, has also changed and adapted over time. It's evolved over time. And so now the modern sort of ways of witchcraft now, the practices of modern witchcraft, they're loosely based on ancient witchcraft and on ancient magical practice of cunning folk. And they encompass things like spellcraft is obviously a major part, sort of crafting and casting of spells. Then we have potions and potion craft, and that's the crafting and creating and imbibing of potions in that sense. And potions, as we'll kind of discuss on a later date, is that's a wide term in itself. It's not just what what most people think of when we talk about a potion. We part of the disciplines are herb lore, understanding not just the herbal and medicinal aspects of plants, and particularly as a green witch, that is a big part of my practice, understanding about plants and their properties, their medicinal properties, but also the fact that they are beings in and of themselves. They're beings in their own right. Plants and trees all are their own being. They're not just things that we use. And it's developing that deep understanding about what they are and also the medicinal and magical properties of plants and trees and so on. And then also, it's the understanding of how energy works, how we use energy, how we move energy. And the idea is that we move through the world in an intentional and aware kind of way. So everything in our lives is done in an intentional way. There's nothing kind of left to chance, because often we don't believe in chance. We believe that the vast majority of witches will believe that we have control over our lives. The whole thing about being a witch is about empowerment and control. And that's part of why we set up Silvercrow and why we set up this podcast. We set this up as a way of empowering people in order to sort of connect with their magic and find the magic that's within them. Because we all have the magic within us all. There's magic around us all the time. I guess what being a witch does is it helps us unlock that magic. It kind of helps us become aware of the magic. As children, we all know that the world is magical as children, but I guess we forget that over time, and we start to limit ourselves and place sort of limited beliefs upon ourselves. And so part of that is that we become more aware of our own magic. We become more aware and more used to seeing the magic around us, and then it helps us to go through the world in a more aware and intentional manner. And as a result of that, then what tends to happen is we bring balance into our lives. We bring a lot more balance into our lives. We bring a lot more happiness. We bring a lot more control into our lives. We're able to control the things that we do, the things that we say, the things that we think, and our actions. And all of that is kind of an empowering thing in itself. So that is something that we'll sort of touch on and we'll dig a bit more into in sort of further episodes down the line. But for this episode, at least, I hope these sort of definitions of witchcraft and what a witch is in terms of what we see it as now have kind of helped to solidify things in your mind a little bit. The idea is that the whole purpose in this podcast is about empowerment and empowering you in order to step into your own sort of power, as whether you're new to witchcraft, whether you're a baby witch, whether you're already a seasoned witch, or whether you're just curious about the whole world of witchcraft in general. The idea is to sort of give you some context and some truth. We'll be digging into the history of witchcraft. We'll be digging into the practice. We'll be digging into modern witchcraft, ancient witchcraft, and all manner of topics that are connected to this topic. So I hope you'll join us on future episodes, and I hope you enjoyed this first of many episodes of the Urban Witch podcast. So so I hope you join us soon. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Witch podcast, where truth, empowerment, and magic align. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on the socials. And stay wise, stay wild, and keep the magic alive. Take care all.